Hello, I'm Sinead Gibney and I'm studying Equality in the School of Social Justice in University College Dublin, and you're watching my minor thesis for this Masters. In March 2013, a proposal was brought to the Icelandic government to ban violent pornography. Technically, pornography is already banned in Iceland, but the legislation is not enforced. The bill was not successful, but it prompted huge debate, both within Iceland and in traditional and new media across the globe. This film takes a look at this proposed ban and asks one specific question. Is the threat to internet freedom warranted in Iceland's efforts to ban violent pornography? In feminist research, we acknowledge that there is no view from nowhere, meaning that everyone has a personal perspective on the world. It is impossible to remove your influences when you're engaged in research. Indeed, although we strive to remove bias, trying to become fully objective is not only impossible, but can negatively impact on the research process. It is considered good practice to declare your position at the outset. For that reason, I'd like to state that I'm a feminist. More specifically, on the topic of pornography, my stance leans towards anti-pornography feminism, and we'll learn more shortly about what those different perspectives are. In terms of the internet, I very much support a free and open internet. I also work for a large search engine that you may have heard of, called Google. And I'd like to declare at this point that any views expressed in this film are my own and not those of my employer. In terms of background, I'm a white, Irish, middle-class, straight, single mother with good education. This is relevant because when we discuss issues like equality, human rights and minorities, it is often the privileged in society, like myself, who theorise and speak on behalf of those groups who are most affected. The reason I chose to explore this particular topic is because it is a fascinating, modern example of the age-old conflict between censorship and freedom of expression. As I mentioned, I'm a big supporter of a free and open internet. I believe that the internet has been a great force of change in our society, providing greater access to information for more and more people. The way that the internet was built is a wonderful example of human collaboration. The technology relies on a set of protocols which decentralize control and create strength in the network. There are, of course, very sinister activities on the internet, and we're seeing increasing threats to the open nature of how it operates. Throughout my studies, I've tried to find points of connection between the internet and technology more generally, and equality, which I'm studying. And there are plenty of them. How being digitally literate in today's society is a new form of capital, and how the digital divide is deepening the social divide in many parts of our society. How we can learn from the internet and take what is a fascinating example of human collaboration and map it onto other institutions in our society: law, government, the economy. How the internet is challenging the ivory towers of academia and transforming how we access education. And how the internet has fueled and assisted in uprisings across the globe. But I chose to study this particular clash between pornography and the internet because it challenges, more than any other topic I've come across, my belief that the internet should remain free and open. A few things to mention before we dive in. There will be no pornographic imagery in this film, violent or otherwise, but I will be discussing content of an adult nature. A lot of people are uncomfortable discussing the topic of pornography, so I'll do my best to address this throughout. And I would also encourage you, the viewer, to keep an open mind. It's also worth mentioning that there is no clear answer to this question. It is a very complex topic, and the objective of this thesis is to look at it from different angles and to analyse the current debate. So I'll start by taking a look at the ongoing research in the two areas of pornography and internet freedom. Within pornography, I'll consider the prominent feminist perspectives on porn, and also some of the statistics regarding its impact. Under the banner of internet freedom, I'll then take a look at the origins of the internet and the ongoing struggle for net neutrality. I'll then explore the backdrop to this ban in Iceland and the motivation behind the bill, before I draw out what I feel are the prominent points of this debate, and then conclude with my own thoughts. For now, let's park some of the details of this discussion, like what exactly is considered to be violent pornography and how does Iceland plan to ban it? And instead we'll deal with these two separate topics of pornography and internet freedom before we bring them together in a discussion of the activities in Iceland. Within feminist theory, there are three broad categories of thinking about pornography: anti-pornography feminism, anti-censorship feminism, and pro-pornography feminism. Historically, the debate has played out predominantly in the US, both in terms of academic contribution, but also in terms of the efforts of the movement to shape a legal response. As I said at the outset, the stance that I identify with most strongly, and the one we're going to look at first, is anti-pornography feminism. This approach comes from the second wave feminism and the radical ideals of 1960s America. Some of the descriptions of pornography in this viewpoint are that it is a form of hate speech, a human rights violation, or a form of group defamation, the group in question being women. In Catharine MacKinnon's paper, Porn as Defamation and Discrimination, she explains that those of us who are exposed to pornography become desensitized to the violence shown to women within it. She directly links 4 crimes to the consumption of porn. Firstly, coercion into pornography, which refers to the practice of manipulating and grooming often very vulnerable people to perform in pornographic movies. Secondly, forcing pornography on a person, a practice that is known to take place during sexual assaults, where violent pornography is used as a type of training video for the victim. Thirdly, assault due to specific pornography, and I have been truly shocked in my research at how much pornographic content is comprised of assault, acts that would simply not be tolerated in any other circumstances. And finally, trafficking in pornography, which is not to be confused with human trafficking, but instead describes the practice of dealing and trading in pornographic material, movies, books, pictures, websites. This final category, trafficking in pornography, was to be the civil rights tool by which all women would be able to bring a case against pornographers. MacKinnon was the legal brains behind this approach that she worked on with another leader in the anti-porn feminist movement, Andrea Dworkin. Women are routinely dehumanized in pornography, they explain. And when men then orgasm while watching this, their pleasure becomes connected to the subordination of women. Pornography then succeeds in making sexism sexy. The characterizing of pornography as defamation is the real crux of anti-pornography feminism. As we'll see, anti-censorship feminism believed more strongly that there needed to be a causal link proven between consumption of pornography and the committing of violent and sexual crimes. Whereas this proof is not necessary if one acknowledges that the creation of pornography itself is the crime.
Now that the law has adopted the point of view of the pornographers on women's rights as its basis for state policy, holding that pornography is more important than the women they know it harms, one might ask again the same questions that are asked of the classic experiences of group defamation. Why the silence? Why the complicity? How can we let this go on? How can it be officially permitted? How can the law be so twisted as to collaborate in it? What are people thinking? Don't they know? Don't they see? Don't they care? Perhaps the lack of explanation for the success of past campaigns of group defamation is connected with the lack of recognition of present ones. Why have most of you not all heard this before? Why have those of you who have seen the pornography not seen it in this way? And now that you know, why will most of you find satisfying reasons to do nothing about it?
Now to the second school of thought that we will look at, anti-censorship feminism. The point of departure for the two is around the acceptance of a causal connection between exposure to violent pornography and the likelihood of its consumers committing sexual crimes. As anti-porn feminists worked on their legal strategy, this group of feminists began to distinguish themselves from the more radical school of thought. They believed that the research was not strong enough to prove this connection. Nadine Strossen, a renowned scholar in this branch of feminism and the first female leader of the American Civil Liberties Union, asked the question in her 1996 paper, "Do we have to choose between freedom of speech and equality?" In this paper, she built on the connection between pornography and hate speech, but she strongly opposed any government regulation of hate speech. She put forward the argument that censorship of hate speech only serves to bring sympathy to the bigots and drive responses to their hate speech underground, that it reinforces stereotypes of helpless minorities and diverts us from addressing the real ills of discrimination. Similarly, she iterated that censorship of pornography would perpetuate the perception of women as victim, that it would harm women's own sexuality, and that it would strengthen the cause of the right-wing conservatives and their patriarchal agenda. The Feminist Anti-Censorship Task Force produced an argument known as the Fact Brief, which became the focal point for the debate between the two camps. And although this group could be described as the less radical of the two, they harked back to the original civil liberty values of first-wave feminism.
I agree with the analysis of the problem and am deeply committed to working towards solving it. However, I strongly disagree that censorship is a solution. To the contrary, precisely because women and minorities are relatively powerless, it makes no sense to hand the power structure yet another tool that it can use to further suppress them in both senses of the word. Consistent with the analysis of the censorship advocates themselves, the government will inevitably wield this tool, along with others, to the particular disadvantage of already disempowered groups. This conclusion is confirmed by the enforcement record of all censorship measures around the world and throughout history.
The third response, pro-pornography feminism, does not belittle male violence against women, but rejects the notion that pornography is central to male domination. Pro-pornography instead views pornography as having a liberatory quality that moves women away from the domesticity imposed by patriarchal norms. This group often refers to itself as sex-positive feminism, although many anti-pornography feminists, like myself, would argue that they too are pro-sex but anti-pornography. The various feminist schools of thought differed not only in their analysis of pornography and its impact, but also in their forms of response. The more radical groups were disposed to activism and seeking legal solutions to their challenge, whereas much of the debate has since been in the academic realm, with little legal or civil action to focus on since the early 90s. In the meantime, pornography has seen unprecedented growth, largely attributable to the parallel growth of the internet. So before we move on to the topic of internet freedom, we're going to have a brief overview of some statistics on pornography, and also those groups who are primarily impacted by it. Although the exact impact of pornography is disputed, we can say that there are three main groups who are to varying degrees impacted by its existence. Those involved in the creation of it, those involved in the consumption of it, and those affected by its cultural influences. This last group is pretty contentious, so we're going to save that for the discussion section. But let's now take a look at some statistics behind the first two groups. First, a caveat. My attitude to statistics is one of skepticism. It seems that for every study that bolsters a point, there is a set of data to refute it. So instead of selecting a statistic to illuminate a point, I've chosen a couple of sets of data that show how contentious this reporting can be. The first statistic is the average length of time that a porn actress remains in the industry, otherwise known as her shelf life. Gail Dines believes that this number is now just 3 months. Statistics from the porn industry itself acknowledge that there has been a sharp drop in the last couple of decades, but it puts it much higher, at 9 years in the 70s, reducing to just 3 years now. Actresses are said in the same survey to complete just 19 movies on average in their entire career. The sobering thought is what is behind these numbers, the reason why an actress lasts such a short time. Regarding the group of people consuming pornography, there are some startling statistics that tell us that 11 is the average age that a child in Iceland first views pornography, and that 12 to 17-year-olds have the highest rate of pornography consumption. More recent statistics tell us that that age group is higher, and it is as yet unclear how the consumption of pornography across different devices is factored into this. For me, the story behind these numbers is that we don't have any idea yet what will be the impact of this kind of consumption of pornography on a new generation of adolescents who have, in just a short number of years, seen unprecedented growth in access to all kinds of pornographic material. Now let's jump to the very different topic of internet freedom. After we've explored some of the research in this field, we'll bring together both areas in an analysis of the happenings in Iceland. From its inception, the World Wide Web was open in nature when Tim Berners-Lee opted to use open source software to create it. This built on the already collaborative nature of the protocols used to shape the internet and how it operated. These were known as the Internet Protocol Suite and consisted of the Transmission Control Protocol and the Internet Protocol, otherwise known as TCP/IP. Developed in the 1970s in a section of the US Department of Defense called DARPA, these protocols determined how information was transferred across networks. And let's just pause here and go over the very early design of the internet, because it's so important to understand this when discussing the openness of the internet itself. Throughout the 60s, a number of scientists had been experimenting with the transfer of information across networks. Some of this was coming from the academic sector, and some of it from the military, both acknowledging the power and importance of a distributed system for connecting machines that could transfer information. A need emerged for a way to connect a number of different networks that could operate separately, but with an underlying connection. A network of networks, the internet. The TCP/IP protocol was then created to dictate how the information was transferred within this system. It consisted of different layers of activity that represented the different networks and how they interacted with each other. To use a favourite analogy, the internet is like a road network. The World Wide Web is the variety of shops, houses and buildings along the sides of those roads. And the protocols are like the rules of that road system. What's important is that those rules were created in such a way as to allow anyone to build shops and houses on the roadside, and allow those businesses to flourish and interact without any cost and without having to ask for permission to do so. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about the openness of the internet. Indeed, the power of it is that the road systems and rules of the road are so accessible that the users themselves have continued to build those roads and have created the vast internet that is now so ubiquitous in our lives. We take it for granted today, but the internet is very much influenced by the decisions that engineers made in those early days to not make the technology proprietary. Josh Levy's paper, Before SOPA There Was Net Neutrality, in Hacking Politics, gives a very clear overview of the short history of net neutrality. It wasn't until 2005 that a struggle for net neutrality emerged, a defence of the open design of the internet, which was in direct response to a US Supreme Court decision to recategorise an internet provider from one type of service provider to another. This recategorisation removed some of the protections afforded to the internet providers and meant that companies would now be able to control in a traditional, market-driven way the means of delivery of the content that was being sent over the internet, and also the content itself. We would begin to see tolls appearing on the road system that is the internet, and even the equivalent of a car tax. In 2006, SaveTheInternet.com was launched and became the first example of the internet community using the internet to save the internet. It created its very own First Amendment, namely network neutrality, And it succeeded in preventing a change in the Federal Communications Act of 1996, which would have been a major threat to the openness of the internet. In 2008, the network neutrality policy of the Federal Communications Commission was tested when Comcast sued them for trying to control its actions in blocking peer-to-peer downloads. The unanimous decision against the FCC proved that their supposed protection of net neutrality was very weak. In its reaction, the FCC acknowledged the failure, but hoped for new ways to build in a more robust defence for an open internet. And although there was great hope that this would come in the Obama administration, we have instead seen a huge backlash in lobbyists, which ultimately resulted in the biggest threat yet to internet freedom in the form of SOPA. The Stop Online Piracy Act and its partner bill, the Protect Intellectual Property Act, known as SOPA and PIPA, both tried to regulate the internet by giving the US government the power to block access to websites, including social media platforms, that were hosting copyright-protected material. This second category was very important because it meant that community-based websites like YouTube or Flickr would be prosecuted if even one of their many users breached copyright law. The reaction this time was even more vociferous. After all, the internet was now a very different landscape. The very platforms that were under threat were the means by which literally hundreds of millions of users from all over the world got behind the net neutrality movement. Indeed, if SOPA did achieve anything, it succeeded in mobilising an army of internet users. So you can perhaps appreciate now why any threat to net neutrality, even one that seems benign, has to be taken seriously and analysed carefully. So now to Iceland, where in March 2013, a bill was brought to government to ban violent pornography. Before we look at the motivation and talk to one of the primary engineers of the bill, let's take a step back in time to 2008 and Iceland's spectacular financial meltdown that led to the crisis and the unique reaction we've witnessed there since. In 2008, Iceland's economy collapsed when the country experienced a devastating financial crisis. In the years prior to this, Iceland's three main banks had experienced huge growth as their balance sheets and lending portfolios sharply increased from 2003 onwards. As a result of the crisis, all of the banks were nationalised, and the country entered into a harsh bailout programme with severe austerity measures. In 2009, protests against the government's handling of the crisis reached a climax, and the Conservative government was forced to resign and a new left-wing government was created in its wake. So far this sounds like your run-of-the-mill country in recession meets public backlash drama. But here's where Iceland went a bit off script and took a different course of action to other countries in similar circumstances. The new government that was formed in 2009 was sympathetic to Icelandic public opinion and set in place a series of measures that were aligned with this. These included prosecutions of former government and financial leaders who had been in power during the crisis and who were now being held responsible for it. A series of referenda to help determine how Iceland was going to deal with the aftermath of the crisis, and specifically the terms of IceSave, a financial recovery package for one of the banks. 25 members of the public were selected to form a group that would review the constitution and crowdsource ideas and content for a new constitution through social media such as Twitter. And a series of gender-focused measures, such as the criminalisation of customers rather than sex workers, a banning of strip clubs, an increase in female representation in government, and a narrowing of the gender pay gap. Let's hear now from someone who was close to the action during this time period, Cathy Scott from the Ireland-Iceland project.
There was a kind of huge visceral anger and emotional kind of surge for the first couple of days. And I think there was a sense of hope and a sense of slowing things down and going back to human-centred systems and looking at what is our moral compass, what kind of society do we want to live in. So they moved into that territory quite quickly. They moved through the anger and back into looking at how to reshape their society with human values at the centre of it. Let's be honest here, around the world there was a lot of, everybody was looking, perhaps naively, or through rose-coloured glasses of what happened in Iceland, but there has been a lot of hardship. There's been cuts in the transport system, the healthcare system, and the education system. People have left keys in cars and left their homes behind because people were crippled with mortgages. Also, other interesting grassroots organisations sprung up, like the National Assembly happened quite quickly, where they began to measure the response of people's thinking from pre-crash to during the crash to post-crash, using a system called spiral dynamics. The Ministry of Ideas and IMMI all sprung up around that time. So there was an activation, a concrete response by people forming together in alternative, not top-down ways and cross-sectorally to respond in some way to the systems that have begun to collapse.
So it was against this socially progressive backdrop that we then see the introduction of the bill. Ogmundur Jónasson is the former Interior Minister who drafted the bill and whose ministry facilitated a lengthy consultation process on the issue of sexual violence with representatives from the police, legal and academic experts, and child protection specialists. The motivation for the bill was to protect children from exposure to pornography. And let's talk now to somebody who was instrumental in its creation, Halla Gunnarsdóttir, political advisor to former Minister Jónasson. If you could tell us a little bit about the motivations for putting this together.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, we did not originally sit down to discuss violent porn.
Okay.
Sat down to discuss sexual violence and the process of sexual violence within the justice system.
Okay.
And in that process, we did learn that you can't avoid the discussion of violent porn when you're discussing sexual violence. Mm-hmm. We had experts, police, prosecutors, child protection units, people from the educational field expressing their concerns that violent porn was influencing at least the nature and possibly the scope of sexual violence in Iceland. We decided to set down some holistic policy regarding violent porn, and parts of that policy are included some legal amendments that suddenly reached attention of the world media.
I wondered if you could comment if it was debated at any point the description of violent pornography or pornography in general as hate speech, as group defamation.
Yes, that was discussed. We haven't got far enough in that discussion, and I think this discussion needs to be taken on a broader platform. Mm-hmm. And this is what Europe is struggling with, to try to sort out how do we define hate speech and how do we manage it also when it comes to the internet. Because the internet is not a society in itself, it's just a part of our society. Yeah. And I would argue if a relatively casual scene from a porn movie or a porn clip would be set up on a frequented street corner in Dublin, where people pass by on the way from work or to work, where children pass by, I think all Dubliners would react. Yeah. So why should we turn the blind eye to it when it happens on the internet? And this is what is happening today. And it's not like children are trying to reach out to find pornography. It's the porn industry that reaches out to find them.
And now I'd like to recap on the original thesis question, so that we can take what we've learned and apply it to this specific topic. Is the threat to internet freedom warranted in Iceland's efforts to ban violent pornography? Well, first, let's define what we mean by violent pornography. At first glance, you might think that this refers to a niche section of the pornographic content available online. But studies that the Icelanders were working off deemed 90% of all pornography to be violent. In a scene-by-scene analysis, content was deemed to be violent if any aggression, verbal or physical, was displayed at any point in the scene. The predominant form of pornography now available is called gonzo pornography. The term gonzo means that the camera is right in on the action. And characteristics of gonzo pornography are that it is normally filmed as if from the point of view of one of the actors, normally the man, that there are fewer wide shots and more close-ups of body parts, and that there is little attention given to plot or dialogue. I said at the outset that I am not going to include any pornographic imagery in this film. and I'm going to keep that promise. But what I'd like to do now is read out excerpts from porn sites that are easily accessible on the internet to give you an idea of the misogynistic message that is coming through. So if you're of a delicate disposition, or perhaps a bit young, then please just hit the mute button and keep it muted until this icon is gone. I'm going to conduct a basic search here of the words XXX pornography. And I'm going to click on the first link that comes up. And what I have in front of me is a selection of stills from porn movies, and I'm just going to read out some of the titles. Real act of defloration. And here we see a penis covered with blood just coming out of a vagina. Filthy Arab girl loves sucking on some. Deep throat and deep loving with teen. And horny sluts suck cock in front of the crowd. And if I go one click further into one of the categories listed here on the left, these titles get worse again. I'm going to click on throat fucking category, and here are some more sample titles. I'm Mara at gag on my cock, and we see a woman's face with makeup running, and she's obviously been crying, and she's being roughly held by her hair with a penis in front of her face. Beautiful brunette Diana at gag abuse. Isabel Ice needs ass sex to live. And beautiful Ebony Marie, love hard ass fucked. I've chosen the ones that are overtly misogynistic. But in most porn, women are routinely dehumanized. They're never depicted in loving terms, nor is sex depicted as something that people do in a loving situation. Men are always in the position of power, and women are nearly always submissive, ready for sex, and often being physically abused. This is the message that the Icelanders are trying to keep from their children. I decided to talk to an expert in child psychology to learn more about the effects on young people of exposure to this type of pornography.
And the ideal is that they'll be mature and able to manage that exposure when it happens. I suppose what we know from our studies and understanding in sexual abuse, that when a young person is introduced to that world prematurely through an experience of sexual trauma, that can have unending effects on their mood, their anxiety, and their understanding of themselves, relationships, etc. So what we know from that, we can assume that exposure to pornographic material may indeed have a similar experience in terms of causing a young person undue anxiety, concern, and really distort their understanding of sexual and intimate relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is it that they take then, if they do see these images? What is it that young people take from those images?
Well, I suppose when we look from social learning theory, that young people take more the implicit message than just the visual imagery. And so what we understand from, say, hardcore pornography, that the image suggests that the message is that in order to be male, one needs to be powerful, aggressive, and dominant. And in order to be, I suppose, ideally female, one needs to be overtly sexual, sexually available, and passive. And I suppose the worry is that if that's the message that's implicit through that learning, through that experience, that young people will take that into real life relationships and believe or understand that that's the way in which relationships and intimacy take place. The issue around sexualization of children is a big issue. I know in the UK in 2011 there's a big study done into the sexualization of children, and they found, quite in line what we would have here in Ireland, is that children's clothing lines, online gaming, contemporary music videos, and really mainstream discourse is having quite a high level of sexual content and quite sexually aggressive content as well, which is either leaning from or borrowing from the pornography world. And so again, there's those messages that are, I suppose, much more insipid in how they are expressed and how they're taken on by young people.
Coleman mentioned the sexualization of children and the societal impact of pornography. This is the third group that I mentioned earlier. Those of us who are impacted by the cultural influences of pornography, regardless of our consumption. As pornography has evolved over the last number of decades, so it has pushed the boundaries of what is acceptable in our culture. What was considered hardcore pornography when Hustler magazine first hit the shelves in 1974 is now in the mainstream. Indeed, a song that recently hit the top of the charts includes the line, "I'll give you something big enough to tear your ass in two." One of the most in-depth contributions on this topic comes from Gail, whose book Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality is the culmination of 20 years of research into pornography. Another group that she talks about is the consumers of pornography who are groomed by the industry to consume more and more pornography and increasingly violent content. I searched online for some pornography addiction forums to find out how those in recovery speak about their experiences. The following quote is a particularly poignant one that I came across.
I really can relate to the guy who said he saw changes in his relationships with the women in his life. I found that too, when I'd accumulated a good deal of sobriety. I want to be careful here to express what I'm trying to say. It really was a genuine feeling of being engaged with everyone, but particularly with people of the opposite sex. I saw a difference in how they engaged with me and in how I engaged with them. They were no longer just body parts. They were people, and they were people that I had no ownership over. I was looking into their eyes instead of leering at them. There was no sexual desire at all, not because the women were not attractive, but because I didn't see them that way. It really was an amazing feeling that I want to experience again. The ability to have good, healthy relationships with female peers is a big bonus of recovery.
It is important to remember that those who consume pornography are not ghosts among us. They are our neighbours, our friends, our family. They do so openly and in private, some without issue and others in shame. Now, a little balance is needed in addressing this thesis question. I've given a lot of attention to the topic of pornography and not as much to internet freedom. Another Icelandic perspective is the response to the proposal from the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, IMMI, who issued an open letter to Minister Jónasson.
The current discussion of blocking pornographic content has offered no definition, no evidence, and suggested no technology. This is an affront to the basic principles of society, and while we acknowledge that this discussion is at a starting point, we feel that the way it is being conducted is harmful. It is technically impossible to censor content delivered over the internet without monitoring all telecommunications. Not just unwanted communications or inappropriate material. Everything must be examined automatically by unsupervised machines, which make the final decision on whether to allow the content to continue or not. This level of government surveillance directly conflicts with the idea of a free society. Internet censorship is used by totalitarian regimes in order to restrict people's access to various information and material on the internet. The methods used to conduct this censorship are technically identical to the methods that would be employed by Iceland if these plans were to be implemented. The act of censoring pornography in Iceland differs in no way from repression of speech in Iran, China, or North Korea. By stating that Iceland is considering censoring pornographic material on the internet for moral reasons, they are justifying rather than condemning the actions of totalitarian regimes.
I agree with a lot of what's said in this letter. The technological solutions that currently exist are not adequate. They won't work, and they will jeopardise the freedom of the internet. I'm impressed by the efforts of the IMMI to establish Iceland as an exemplar of transparency and free speech. But I'm also surprised, as Halla was, by the reluctance of so many members of the internet community to even engage in dialogue on this topic. The internet is a huge part of our society now, and although I don't want to see any government restrictions on it, I also don't want to defend the open nature of something that is home to this hate speech. And I do now categorise violent pornography, which is most pornography, as hate speech. Which brings me back to anti-pornography feminism and the case for group defamation. As we saw at the outset, the two main branches of feminist thinking differed in their belief that there needed to be a causal connection between the consumption of pornography and the committing of sexual crimes. A recent radio documentary by Jo Fidgens analysed the effects of pornography and could not establish this link. Furthermore, she learned that this link is unlikely to be established because researchers are now hampered by the prospect of litigation. If they are to expose subjects to pornography who then go on to commit sexual crimes, the researchers themselves will be open to legal prosecution. I think we need to ask ourselves why this issue is here. We've got to the point where we want to protect our children from it, where some people believe that there's a connection between consumption and criminality, and where it is definitely affecting our cultural norms. So if we take all of these three as agreed, then surely now we can position group defamation as a potential legal solution. I have one correction to make. I referred earlier to the bill in Iceland, when actually it was a proposal, a series of debates. I was reminded of this technicality during my conversation with Halla, and it helped to bring me right back to my original position on this question, that the threat to internet freedom is warranted because it facilitates discussion, and without discussion, there can be no solution. So let's have the conversation. Let's stop snapping back to polar opposites on the censorship spectrum and recognize that this is a new situation that demands a new solution, and that the internet should be a part of that solution. I've chosen to conclude with a piece of poetry that I wrote. And here's where I leave all impartiality behind and express in artistic form my journey through the research of this thesis. I hope you've enjoyed accompanying me on this journey and that I've helped to illuminate the topic from a slightly different angle. If you're interested in learning more, I've included below some links to sources that I've referenced throughout the film and that I've come across during my research. Thank you, and bye for now.
Pornography, you anger me because you hate my gender, see?
And feminism means to me a sense of solidarity.
So when you call her bitch and whore, you're calling me the same and more.
My mother, my sister, my beautiful girl, we're all affected by the hate in your world.
Pornography, you're dead to me. I watch you now and all I see
is the hurt you cause, the misery, the sexual abuse, the agony.
Sex is fun, we all know that, so why do you make it into combat?
I get the point about sexual expression, but not when it means gender oppression.
Your industry coerces, manipulates and cons women and men to fulfill your wrongs.
You discard the human wreckage of stars who wear forever their physical scars.
You objectify, dehumanize, and then go on to capitalize.
Pornography, it's time to question what is the impact of your aggression.
The internet has helped to spread the reach of your proposition.
And handheld devices provide ubiquitous transmission.
To the younger amongst us who in their swarms
are slowly developing entirely new norms
of what to expect in relationships or how they should even get their kicks.
Of what is a woman and what is her purpose.
If not to please men, of what else her worth is.
We don't yet know the impact of this increased exposure.
To this narrow-minded, inexact, plasticized disclosure.
Of a misogynistic worldview where women are just sex toys.
We don't yet know what it will do to our young girls and our young boys.
We could argue forever about whether there's a link
between your twisted endeavors and those who push the brink.
Of legality and crime, but we are wasting our time.
We could also move the taste as the main contention.
That your artistic pursuit is just a little left of convention.
But anyone with eyes and a backlit screen
must surely surmise, scene after violent scene,
that a camera doesn't make artistic what is elsewhere in life considered sadistic.
And then there is the consent issue that people get drawn into.
That grown adults sign up for this, they make a lot of dough from it.
When consent assumes that there is choice, it relies on having a resounding voice.
And neither of these are in great supply for those who give you call of reply.
But if we take the position that your message is pure hate,
that your very ambition is to openly equate
masculine with power and feminine the reverse,
a pretty to look at flower, but ultimately a curse,
then an internet ban is not the key. It won't do enough.
It's your entire industry that we really need to snuff.
But first of all, we all must share an open conversation.
Forget the shame and stigma and the righteous indignation.
Because all that serves to achieve is keep your tyranny under wraps.
When we should air our grievances, and then, maybe perhaps,
we might just pierce the veil and help everyone to see.
Your sick and sordid tale of hate and misogyny